In this video, I want to talk a bit more about what it means to fully define a model in Fusion 360, both in terms of fully defining your sketches and also in fully constraining the components of an assembly. So here's a basic model I had started in the last video, just with a couple tube-shaped components, and I'm going to revisit how I created the sketches for these and why they are considered fully defined. And then I'll look at why these components are not currently constrained in the assembly context and how I can remedy that. So to start off with, let's go back to part 1 and look at the sketch. So I'll activate part 1, which you'll notice grays out the other components, making it easy to see what we're working on. And then I'll double click on the sketch. Now, a couple of things to notice about the sketch before I start changing anything. This icon here currently shows a little lock symbol, and all the lines in the sketch are black. That means that currently it is fully defined. If I drag at any point on the sketch, it's not going to move. I've fully set every dimension. So I've set a height, I've set a width, I've set a thickness here, and then there's some geometric constraints preventing any other degrees of freedom. So there's some horizontal and vertical constraints. This is indicating that I used an offset, so there's an offset constraint on this line. Now, let's say I went and deleted this dimension. You'll see two lines turned blue, and the lock turned to a pencil. Now, if I try to drag it, particularly dragging one of these blue lines, you can see it has freedom to move. This is a problem because, if I drew a sketch like that, say I wanted a 1x3 tube and I drew the sketch like that, it looks like a 1x3 tube, but if I go to put the dimension on, it's not actually 1 inch, it's 1.24. So I'll place that dimension and I will type in 1. So to show a few more ways that you can constrain your model, I'm just going to add an additional rib feature showing a few other options. So let's say I wanted a rib in the middle here. So I'll put in a couple lines to indicate that, and you'll notice that I didn't set any width, I didn't set an angle for them, and that needs to be fixed before we move on. They need to be fully defined. So first, I'll use some of these geometric constraints to line these up where I want them. So I'll select a perpendicular constraint and put that here and here. So that makes sure these lines are vertical. Next, I'll use a sketch dimension and type in the width I want. So I'll just make it the same as the outer wall. Now, you'll notice this still has movement to it. And that means we need to set where this is positioned in here. So there's a number of ways you can do this. What I'm going to do for now is use a point on this line to find the midpoint and then position this relative to that. So select point, and if I roll it along, you'll see it snaps to the middle here, and there's a little triangle icon, which is the midpoint constraint. So if I click that, it'll automatically apply that midpoint constraint, locking this point in the middle of that line. Now, I want to position this right there, but I don't want to just do it by look. I want to actually set that. So I'll create a dimension from here to here. And I could just type 0.06, which, because I know that's half of this. But let's say I wanted a more robust solution that would work even if I changed this dimension. If I change this to 0.2, we're not centered anymore. I could, instead of typing this number, select this dimension, and you'll see it puts in the name of the dimension, and that references it. And then use that as part of a formula. So I'll say D13 divided by 2. So you'll see a little fx popped up, and now this number is calculated based on that formula. So if I go back and change this to 0.12, this recalculates accordingly. So now we have a fully defined sketch. You'll see the little lock icons on, everything's black. And we've even used a formula on one of the dimensions to make this easier to edit later if we want to change things. So let's finish that sketch. Now you'll notice it didn't pop up because looking at our timeline, I'll expand the group, the extrude, we added a new region to the sketch, but we didn't select it in our extrude. Now, you could show the sketch and add a new extrude operation. That's typically not a good practice because you don't want to keep stacking new operations. Wouldn't it be better to edit existing ones? Because your goal is to keep this timeline as short and clean as possible to make it easier to go back and change things later. So instead of creating a new one, I will double click on this feature on the timeline and then select profiles and add an additional profile. Which makes sense in this case because we want that middle rib extended the exact same amount as the original tube. So we'll say OK, minimize that, hide our sketch, and go back to the top. So now we have a file with two parts that are based on fully defined sketches, and we've seen how to select the parts and then go look at their sketches and operations and modify them to update the design. But there's still one more problem that needs to be addressed with this file, and that is that these parts don't have a defined location in space. If I click on one and drag it, it can be repositioned. It can be anywhere. And that's not good. We need to define exactly how these parts are related to each other. So I'm going to undo dragging that. Now, the first thing in defining a part is we need to ground one of the parts, which sets it as locked in space, and everything else will be built off of that one part. So I'm going to do that to my first part, but before I do, I'm going to roll my history back to right after I created the first part. And this just will put my ground feature right after it's created, just to help keep things organized, so when I'm looking at the part I can quickly see which part is grounded. Now, to ground this part, I will right click on it and say ground. You'll see a little pin icon shows up, and now if I try to drag it, I can't move it. It's locked in place. So now I'll roll the history marker to the end again to bring up my other part. So this part's locked, but this part's not. So what I'll do next is I'll use a joint to constrain this part to be locked in a certain position relative to this one. So that's available through this joint command. So with the joint command, it will ask me to pick 2 points that I want to lock together. So I'll start, well, first you'll notice this part grayed out because it's grounded. It can't be joined to something, but it can have other parts joined to it. So I'll start by picking my first component, and let's say I want to lock the center of this face, or this ring, to the center of this face. You'll see it shows how it locks in position. And there's a few options here. We could offset it by defined amounts in each axis. We could rotate it. I'm going to set all these to 0 for now. And again, you should be typing the exact number you want here rather than just dragging it. There's a flip command if you wanted it flush rather than mating. And then there's a second tab for motion. For now, I'll just make it rigid, which makes these parts lock to each other. In a later video, I'll talk more about the other options used to simulate moving components. Alright, so our component's locked, no offsets, that face to this face, say OK. And now if I try to drag it, this part's locked. Which is good, because now if we were to create a drawing from this file that we would send to the shop to have somebody machine this part and weld it together, they would know exactly where everything's aligned, and drawings would show the exact dimensions needed. So that's the steps to create an assembly that has fully defined parts and fully defined part positions. So to review, you'll want to make sure all your sketches are fully defined as indicated by this locked icon. You'll want to make sure you've grounded your first component and then used joints to lock any remaining components relative to that first component. And then when you're working on this file in the future, if you want to make a change, you should always go back to your existing sketches and operations, which you can double click on, and modify things there rather than adding new operations to ensure that your whole timeline updates cleanly and your parts are defined very precisely with where they are and what size they are.